So here are some pictures of some mangroves and the river that you take to get to a city that's called Shunantunich, which is Mayan village slash city, which also means stone woman. It was given that name in the 1890s when the people who found it were excavating it and thought that there was the ghost of a woman who they had unleashed once they started excavating this certain area. So here's a site map of the Shunantunich uh, site. If you're looking at this on your right hand side, that would be right here. This picture is the middle A1 right here, and just to the left of that is the ball court, and I'll show you the ball court next. Here's the ball court right here. You can see where people would sit and watch. And the person who was giving us the guide, this is in Belize. You're right on the Guatemalan border, which was actually quite dangerous. I guess Guatemala is a little more dangerous than Belize, so there are like armed guards there making sure that you do not cross into Guatemala. But it's hard to tell where one ends and one begins because you're in the rainforest. But this ball game was kind of like soccer. Hands were not involved, and oftentimes games would go on for days and days, and the winner would be victorious, and the loser, in some cases, would end up dead. Right. So this really was a game of life and death, which is pretty eerie. But it was basically like a ball game, kind of like soccer and basketball put together, but you couldn't use your hands. Here's a picture of the larger of the temples, and I'll show you um, a picture. You can get into the back on the back side of this climb up, and then you can kind of see all of the site. But you can tell the engravings. This was an important. Well, first of all, it's pyramid-like, right? Very much like the Egyptians built, but on a totally different continent and built around the same time period, built the same, had no idea that they were, the Mayans had no idea who the Egyptians were and vice versa, but it's very interesting that they were building things the same at the same time so far away from each other. But you can tell the engravings and the art and the work that went into building this. So here is a view from the top of that, and you can kind of see most of the site from here. And then if you're looking off, that's Guatemala over there. You can't see them, but there are armed guards patrolling that uh, forest pretty heavily. You see them at, they didn't really want you to get close or take pictures. So there you go. But that's just a real quick example of just the majesty. And I mean, it was stinking hot there, and it was January. And I mean, just I can't imagine living in that area full time. I mean, these are highly, you're deep in the jungle. I can't imagine the animals that the Mayans had to deal with during this time period, but you can see the majesty of it all, and it's still fairly untouched by human hands. You can tell this is dense forest. So those are just a couple pictures of the Shunantunich site. If you guys ever get the chance, I would highly recommend going to Belize. So let's talk a little bit about hope in the actual colonization here. At first, it was what Columbus found was seen as a disappointment because after a little more investigation and a little more time there, the Europeans began to realize that there was this huge landmass that was keeping them from Asia. Uh, and Spain knew that Portugal had the spice ring under control. So there was very little doubt now that there were two vast oceans that separated Europeans from India going that way, that direction. But there was still hope because Columbus did bring back some paltry gold samples, and so that creates hope. And really, there's rumors of gold piled on top of each other. Um, which was actually true in some instances. Not true in others, but some of these civilizations and Indian people had more gold than they knew what to do with. But it was a precious metal, but not as precious to them as it was to the Europeans. And one of the most famous of men to find actual gold was Francisco Pizarro. In 1532, with a mere 180 men, he plundered the fabled gold of the Incas and conquered Peru. Like I said, with 180 men, he conquers all of Western South America, a civilization, right? What he does is in November of 1532, he captures their emperor named Atahualpa. He captures him, and while in the process of capturing him, they also kill thousands of indigenous on their way through the city. The Incas offer a massive ransom for his release, and it was actually what the Spanish asked for was enough gold to fit a 22-foot room. The Incas have so much gold that they say okay, so in 1534, so Atahualpa has been held captive for 2 years. The Incas pay the ransom, and the ransom was collected. And then once the ransom was collected, Pizarro had Atahualpa strangled. So that was 1534, the last Incan emperor. Interestingly enough, Francisco Pizarro will eventually be murdered by Hernan Cortez's men over the region that we call, this country that we call Lima today. Peru. Not the country, the city that we call Lima today. But Pizarro was very much a man who came to conquer, and he conquered. So what the Spanish did is they found all of these civilizations that had capital cities. So what they would do is, if they could, they would knock down these cities, but then they would build on top of it. Right, and so they used all of these tools that the Native American, the indigenous had, and the roads that they had, and the postal system that they had, and where they built their cities were in the right places. But the Spanish wanted to create their quote unquote own new world, and so what they would do, much like the Romans did before, is they would raise as much of these villages and cities that they could see, and then they refashion them into Spanish European type or Portuguese type cities instead of indigenous type cities. So the question is how did so few men conquer such a vast amount of people? And if you watch the YouTube videos, you will find out. Basically, it's guns, germs, and steel. The advantages are pretty simple. The Europeans had guns, and they had cannons, and they're fighting people with bow and arrows and spears. It must have been a fearful sight. The Europeans were larger and hairier and more terrifying because they were riding these big animals with horses with wearing armor. They actually were mistook for gods. There's one god who is said, one indigenous god who was said to will come back and he'll have hair on his face and he'll be big, and that's what these Europeans look like to the indigenous. So some of them were mistook for gods, and so it's psychological. There's this huge, hairy man with armor that bow and arrows won't kill him. And he's riding this huge animal that you've never seen before, and he's running people over, and out of his hand it appears that this stick that he has is very accurate and can kill you with one when it's very loud. Something loud happens and then you're dead, right? It's a gun, but you don't know it's a gun. You don't know what that is. This is psychological. Disease is the #1 killer when you watch the malaria, measles, and the plague. There are no numbers how many indigenous people died from disease, but it's well in the millions. We're talking 2-3 million people dying from smallpox. And why did they die from smallpox? Because the Europeans brought it over, and the indigenous had no immunities to that. They also began to the Europeans began to make alliances with smaller tribes who helped them navigate the geography. So, like for instance, the Inks, and so the Spanish would use their enemies not only as trackers and as geography, but as military geography helpers, but as military help as well. Right? So they made alliances with other indigenous groups to fight larger indigenous groups. So that's how a man with 100, these conquistadors are brave, they're treacherous, right? So you add all of this together, and that's how 180 men can end a civilization. That's how. And so never before have so few men won such great realms against enormous odds, but seldom have they acted so repugnant. Murder on a genocidal scale, right up there with Hitler and Stalin and Mao and guys we'll talk about next semester in our Western Civ 102 class. And so the rapidity of it all, just how rapid this occurs, is just mind-boggling. And it's a stark contrast to what the British and the French do in North America. Not to say that the British and the French don't treat the indigenous terribly. Well, the French are actually fairly nice to the indigenous. Not to say that the British don't treat the indigenous poorly. It's just the British was a very slow movement west. The Spanish and the Portuguese in South America dominate within 50, 60 years the continent. Right. It takes the British and their progeny, the Americans, hundreds of years to get to the Pacific coast. Not so much here. By 1540, Mexico, Central America, and the northern part of South America had been secured. It should be noted that the fiercest resistance to any of the Spanish or some Dutchmen too was in Chile and Argentina, because those were the indigenous populations that had never been under centralized rule. So there was fierce guerrilla type war going on down there. And it wasn't until 1580 that Buenos Aires, or what we would consider to be Buenos Aires, the city today, was controlled. But the idea is that in a less amount of time than a century, the two Iberian Peninsula powers, Portugal and Spain, had secured something twice the size of the United States. They had destroyed thousands of years of building, civilization, numbers, writing, agriculture, anything that you can think these civilizations have before the Spanish got there is destroyed, almost completely destroyed in 80, 90 years. So once the Spanish get there, then you get this idea about paternalism. And we kind of talked about the causes earlier, but it can all be boiled down to what we consider to be the 3 G's: gold, glory, and God, or gold, glory, and gospel. What happens is once they started colonizing, what the Spanish did is put viceroys ruling as government, right? So it was like they were paid handsomely, about what would be considered to be about $200,000 a year our time, so that there was no corruption, but it did happen. But what these viceroys were supposed to do was they were supposed to be from the crown, and they were supposed to be what the Spanish and the Portuguese wanted. They were like the mouthpieces for the Spanish and the Portuguese government. And so whatever the Spanish and the Portuguese would institute in the colonies, the viceroy was the man to do it. He held audiencias, which is a court of appeal for decisions, um, and they really oversaw everything and reported back to the king or queen. And what this all boils down to is this idea of paternalism. Once the Christian kingdoms got there, the idea is that paternalism, interference of a state with another against its will, right? So it's motivated by a claim that the person interfered will be better off or protected from harm, right? Paternalism means fatherly like. Basically, the idea is the Spanish come in and they come into the Americas and say, we know you don't know what's good for you. We're like your parents. We're smarter than you. We're wiser than you. We have better civilizations than you. We have better religion than you. We have better kids than you. So what you need to do is, and basically, we're going to force you to listen to us because we're like your parent. We know what's best for you. And so what they set up is what's called an encomienda system. And there's the plan and then there's the reality. So what this quote unquote trusteeship was set out to do was to settle the indigenous as productive agricultural laborers in units under supervision. So what happens is these conquistadors would take control over a population and then require them to pay tributes from their land, which were quote unquote granted um, to the indigenous. Basically, the Spanish took the indigenous land, made them work for it, and then made them pay taxes on it. And in return, they'd be quote unquote protected. This is what we call extortion. We call racketeering. When you're the person who is threatening the violence, but also the person who is saying that I am keeping you from violence, that's racketeering. And that's what the Europeans did. So in theory, it was intended to help them, the indigenous, but by exploiting them, but you were helping them because you were quote unquote Christianizing and civilizing them. But all this did was bound the indigenous to the land and tribute to the governor, who treated the indigenous as their own property. And that's what was expected, because since it was the land governed and possessed by the king. So what happens is the conquistadors come and they say, I take this land in the name of Spain. So if you're taking this land in the name of Spain, what you're doing is you're taking it in the name of king. So technically it's the king and queen's land when we're talking about Spanish or Portuguese land. Right? So they're saying this is not it's not necessarily ours, but it is the king's. And so everything the benefit of the Spanish government. But what it also really did is, besides binding people to the land, it also bound them to the church and to the priests. The church absolutely contributed to the foundation of absolutism in Spain. And so it serves the same function in the New World. The crown appointed its own dignitaries. The priest would nothing was allowed to be built, especially churches or anything, without priests' approval. So I'd like to note here before we keep going is that this isn't what's happening is indigenous are dying at a large rate now. Dying from disease, they're dying from being conquered, they're dying from hard work that they're not. Indigenous are smaller than Europeans and they're smaller than Africans, but they're made to do work that they're made to do more work than they are capable of, physically capable of. So you're dying from disease, you're dying from overwork and exhaustion, and you're dying from cruelty. So millions, and we'll get a little bit more into the numbers, but while the indigenous are dying, it's not to convert people to Christianity. You need people alive. However, if they died, then they died. They were, and I quote, weak, simple, unarmed subjects, right? So you can see what the indigenous how the Europeans view the indigenous. And do is it teaches the population what Jesuits we talked about last week are good at is assimilating. They learn languages, they learn culture, so then they can really the priests teach the indigenous to obey the king. Pretty simple. And it should be noted also that when they become deprived of their temples and other religious institutes, the indigenous actually quickly, quote unquote, accept the religion of their conquerors. Um, Although the question that Europeans had at this time is, did the indigenous really convert? And even if they did convert, did they have souls? Because they're just such lesser human beings than Europeans are, right? There were actual debates about that, whether they should convert the indigenous or not, whether it mattered, because they may not have souls. But you should also realize that the symbolism and imagery of Catholicism really appealed to the indigenous imagination, right? There's icons, it's very bright. There's incense. There's all of these dogmatic principles and rituals that we've already discussed. These kind of well with the indigenous, and hence the most prominent in the world now are in South America. And there was also this idea that Christianity teaches of hope and eventual release from life. So if you're enslaved and your family's dying from disease, you can go to heaven is actually not a fairly bad idea. Like, I can't wait till this life is over so I can start my new one, right? Line is these encomienda systems and these large aggregates that are being created by the Spanish are essentially private estates for these Spanish people who run them, or Portuguese for the Europeans. And it's really the person who owned the land for the ground could dispose of humans however he saw fit. And so this whole idea about all of this is built around mercantilism. And mercantilism is this economic idea that's beginning to dominate thinking in Western civilization, which was the demand for colonies to exist for the benefit of the mother country. You bring in bullion, gold, and contribute toward making your empire rich and powerful. It's the bringing in of natural resource and then exporting those goods out. And that's what colonies do. They provide us with goods and gold and silver and sugar and spices, raw materials, iron, sugar from the West Indies and Brazil wood. These are very important things, and through mercantilism, they're all being the idea of these colonies, of taking these things from the colony and then bringing them back to Europe is the idea is so that a home government had the right to regulate and control the economic activities of the colonies. And so what you get is the absolute subjugation of people and land to the benefit of European empires, right? A lot of this wealth is not staying in the Americas, rather it's going to through Europe, and the Portuguese and the Spanish and pretty soon the British, we'll get into the British a little bit next week, are becoming richer empires than this world had ever seen. And so there's this real realization that the wealth lay in the land and the labor supply of the Americas, and that they needed the indigenous or somebody to do the work over there. So you also have, once Europeans get there, I love this picture, you have all of this mixing of new people, right? You create basically a whole new world, and society changes. And I should just say the Europeans do is create a highly stratified military-like command. Right, we're on top, everybody else is below us. So civilian officials were appointed by the king, and ecclesiastical dignitaries were at the top of the class. It's stratified, meaning there's an upper class, and then everything is lower than them. But you're put into groups. So if you were a Spaniard who came over, who is an official, or you are somebody who does a dignitary for the church, you are at the top of the societal structure. Then you get creoles below them. They were people who were of Iberian descent, whose parents were from Spain or Portugal, but they were born in the Americas, right? So they are Spanish or Portuguese or whatever, but they were born in South America. Those are what Creole are. These were the landed aristocrats who garnered the most wealth with land and mercantilism. The Creoles controlled government through councils after a few generations, but they were excluded from church and state. So that's why they're number two. They probably have as much power and wealth as the civilian officials. They're still number two. This will actually make them better and will lead to lots of revolts later. The third class was mestizos, and mestizos were indigenous. So a lot of children obviously being born now of people who have European descent and indigenous. And they had it rough, but at the same time, they were just as ruthless to those below them as everybody was ruthless to them above them. So at the bottom of this encomienda system, obviously, is the indigenous. They were basically a commodity, and they were the most profitable of all spoils, and they were virtual slaves. So basically, when the Europeans get to the Americas, they use the to take down their empire and then build a new one. And so here is a picture of all. And then there were a few African slaves mixed in, and they had it bad. The African slaves were even worse off than the indigenous. But in the beginning, there's very few African slaves. But as you can see, and we might talk about a little bit next week, that changes drastically, especially, excuse me, especially when the Europeans realize that the indigenous just aren't, and they keep dying, and they need more. They need stronger people, so they turn to Africa. So that's how the society is stratified as well. So it's very militaristic, very based on skin color, where you were born, and so on and so forth. So lastly, I just want to talk about the legacy of some of the colonization and some of the people who tried to create a better world for the indigenous. And one of them, and Bartolome de las Casas, and he writes an excellent book called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. He also writes a book called In the Defense of the Indians. And what De las Casas' story goes like this. In 1502, he comes over. He's a lawyer, he's a priest, he's a historian, and he wrote extensively on the condition of the indigenous peoples. He is absolutely in the idea of understanding the indigenous were not physically built for such hard labor that the Europeans were putting on them, and he couldn't understand why the Europeans could not understand this. An interesting thing about being a priest there, it comes with two advantages. One, you have almost complete freedom of speech. You have material independence because the church is quite wealthy at this time and you're collecting taxes. So in the Americas, he could go and express himself as he liked. So as he went around the countries and the countryside, he saw that the indigenous were being treated so poorly by the conquistadors that he thought maybe we can put them under church control and not under the control of these encomiendas, these conquistadors who are basically killing all the people on the land. And so, interestingly enough, he is also who was a major advocate of using African slaves for work, not indigenous. He later recanted that. He actually owned a couple African slaves himself. He will later recant that, but it was too late. However, um, it is not true that he is the man who he did bring African slaves over, but he is not the man who introduced African slaves to the New World, like a lot of people said he did. And so what he does is Spain to create these encomienda type agricultural farms, but under the power of the church, and people will be taught, or not taught, the people will be treated better. This was a failure. Food and subsidies being sent to these new church-run farms were stolen. People would, especially the indigenous, would come. They would attack the priests and the church because they didn't have such a military presence like the conquistadors, and a lot of people were running away for good reason. Another interesting point about the Spanish is they had already abolished slavery in Spain in early 1500s, except for prisoners of war and punishment. So what they were doing in the Americas, they called it "quote unquote" agrarian serfdom. And De las Casas fights hard to get the indigenous peoples out of whatever you want to call it, whether it's agrarian serfdom or slavery. It was outright slavery. Actually get some things done because he's a priest. In 1543 and 1544, the king and queen passed new laws which did not abolish serfdom but did limit their conquistadors from gaining more land and treating people so poorly. And so the conquistadors were starting to see their encomiendas get smaller, and this made them mad. What it also did is the crown started taking land, quote unquote, taking land from the conquistadors, which is land that their ancestors or them themselves took from the indigenous, and allowing De las Casas and other parts of the other men from the church to create their own encomiendas on. And obviously many conquistadors become upset at this. There's also the new laws that gives people, indigenous people, rights. Rights is like the ability to not be a slave, to be paid, to be compensated for the land they took. Little small steps, not huge steps, but little small steps that really upset the Europeans or people of European descent who live in the Americas, because now you have this renegade priests who keep tattling on you to the Spanish monarch who's whatever 3,000 miles away, 35. The king and the Spanish monarchy is sending back all these laws saying treat people better, and we're taking land from you and giving it to churches, etc., etc. And now there's even these laws that De las Casas once passed that would give indigenous people rights. Favorable. Eventually he kind of has to run away from the Americas. Not only does he fight for rights of the indigenous, but he becomes the father of what is known, or something that we call social Christianity today. The Pope is a liberationologist, because this is something that resonates deeply with people from South America into today, and De las Casas is the father of this. So in 1510 he became a priest in Hispaniola, and so he begins to see what's happening to everything, and he starts to interpret Jesus' suffering in terms of liberation from unjust economic, political, and social conditions. And he says that through the poor suffering, through their struggle and hope, I create a critique of society and of the Catholic faith. He tried Spanish rule there politically and culturally, and he really starts to try to fight poverty. Right, but he's poverty by addressing its source, and he says the source of all poverty really is sin. He creates what are known as Christian-based communities, which is a bottom-up movement that did not adhere to the Pope or Catholic doctrine in general. He took quotes from the Bible to show that Jesus was, quote unquote, bringing a sword, like in Isaiah, and not bringing social order. It's a call to action against poverty and to get justice, right? He says, look at Matthew 10:34. Think not that I come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. So the idea is this: liberation theology. Jesus did not teach people to just confine to the social order of things, because that's what De Las Casas says the opposite. He says, you as indigenous and me as a priest, I'm to fight the wrongdoings that are occurring from the top down. We have a bottom down movement, bottom up movement that talks about Jesus coming to earth for the poor, right? Who did Jesus hang out with? The poor, right? Who were his disciples? The poor. Who did he always get in fights with? The people who were the leaders of society. He was a rebel. And De las Casas says, so what we need to do is accept what the Spanish people are, what the conquistadors are doing, what the church is doing, and what the crown is doing. We need to make sure that we kill poverty, and we kill poverty by helping people through the church and helping them become better Christians. Obviously, this is not something that the Catholic Church wants to hear. He's sent back to Spain. He never gets put in jail. He's kind of an outcast for the rest of his life. But he does get things moving, and he creates his own Christianity that really resonates with South Americans into today. So, with that, let's just briefly talk about the legacy. And most of it's bad if you're an indigenous person. It was basically 3 centuries of humiliation that saw all indigenous civilizations spiral down. They had strong communal instincts that were gone, and they had to learn a new way of life and values. It's a tradition of exploitation and hierarchy buttressed by racism and purity of blood. Right at the top are these people born in Europe who don't have any other blood in them except European. But you also get critics like De las Casas, because which will create this idea that the church really does become a bulwark for the better treatment for the indigenous. Right? It's not what everybody wants to hear, but because of the church and because of men like De las Casas, the way, shape, or form were better treated by the church than they were by the conquistadors in the Spanish or the Portuguese state. And what men like De las Casas were looking at is they were thinking of the new world as utopia, and they are reading Thomas More. If you remember him, Thomas More is the priest who becomes a martyr in England. They're reading his book called Utopia, and so what people are looking for in the new world is like, hey, we really screwed up Europe, right? But now we have all of this land. How can we make it so that it's a better place to live than the Europe of old, right? The people who are coming over the New World are looking for a better life, right? And so what De las Casas and men like that do is basically they're saying, well, yeah, Europeans are just making the New World Europe number 2. But what we can do as the church is we can not be indigenous, but set a moral example for all of European society and create a better society, a quote unquote utopia through good. They built communities with hospitals and schools and provided homes for the indigenous. One community, the Christian-based communities, had 30,000 people in it. That's a large town. That's a large city. by 1500 standards, European or American, right? Jesuit missionaries who worked between Brazil and Argentina cleared the jungle to build productive and self-sufficient communities where the indigenous shared the fruits of their labor, and they were also protected from the force of slave hunters. Which brings up another question about, yes, a lot of the Jesuits and a lot of people like Casas in his ilk create these great places for the indigenous, but the question still remains: are the indigenous better off? Meaning, I don't know if you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, and the last scene of the whole movie, this man is running. He's running from a tribe who's trying to kill him, and he runs onto the beach, and then he sees the Spanish, and then boom, movie over. Right? So the question is are you better living in a quote unquote utopia that's built by the Catholic Church as an indigenous person, or did you live a better life before the Catholic Church was even there, right? Which I think people kind of have their own ideas about that. So that's some of the legacies. It also moves the center of the economic activity away from Italy. Genoa becomes bankers. Venice becomes a tourist destination, but the big. And so we'll see as Spain and Portugal begin to kind of, lose the steam, lose their power. People in the Atlantic coast will take that up from them. The Dutch and the British will be ready to take up when the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire get too strung out and too big to handle. Right, so we're moving the movement of wealth that we've discussed from the Renaissance that was stationed in Italy is slowly moving to Western Europe, and then it will slowly move up into Northern Europe, where the British will dominate the world, basically until World War I, and basically until the end of World War II. You also get an influx of bullion of gold in Europe, which stimulates entrepreneurs. And so this provides an opportunity for vast amounts of people with the ability and the daring to make money. And Europe grows exponentially economically, right? This time of power and money and Western civilization, because of these new colonies, is becoming richer and more powerful than ever. And lastly, we'll end with, on a not so nice note, the death tolls of colonization. I can't give you all of them, but for example, in Hispaniola, when Columbus landed in Hispaniola, there were 250 what would be considered Haiti and the Dominican Republic today. In 56 years, there were 500 indigenous people left on that island. Florida, once the Spanish reached Florida, the population from 1 million indigenous to 50,000 in 50 years. And Mexico's population fell 90% in the century Europeans got to the Americas. So there's a legacy of cruelty, hierarchy, and death for the indigenous peoples by the Europeans, but there's also this legacy of liberation theology and the idea that these colonies are making the Western world the most dominant civilization, civilization in the world. And so we'll end next week of this kind of absolutism and constitutionalism and the creation of this Atlantic system that we'll talk about more next semester in our 102 class. So that's your presentation for the week. If you have any question, please let me know.